Next up, we have Steve Ash. Steve is the current Director of Graduate Programs and Assistant Dean of Academic Programs for the College of Business. And he's also the individual that gave me those insights on John Winsick. So aren't you happy how I handled that, Steve? All right. How'd that feel when that bus ran over you there? No, okay. Now, Steve is going to share his insights on leadership and teams. So, Steve?
Thank you very much. It really is exciting to have a group together again. We had to skip our event entirely last year, as you may know, and we're so thrilled to have such quality speakers and presenters. And I'm just thrilled to kind of squeeze into that program of these really good speakers. So I'll take a few minutes to go over a few things I was asked to talk about from the academic perspective. What is it we know about teams? What are the issues that we know something about? We've been doing research in teams for around 80 years formally. And so there's a PowerPoint deck I think is going to start any minute now. That's about groups and teams, and we'll talk about that. Thank you. And I want to thank those who've been coming to these events know that we've got this terrific Master of Ceremonies, Mike Polovic, and he likes to have a little bit of fun in addition to keeping things on the rails. He was the executive VP of HR at Smithers before, and they still tell a lot of stories about him. And one that I find particularly amusing that I just have to share is when he was deciding to do something on his own instead of sending his minions to do something. And so he was standing in front of the shredding machine with a stack of some papers, and he's trying to figure out how to make it go. And finally an intern came along and said, "Sir, do you need help with that?" And he says, "Yes, I really do. I thought I could do it on my own, but this is pretty high technology, so I need some help." I said, "Okay, you reach over here, you hold the switch, and you turn the button on, you feed it in here." And as his document was being shredded, Mike tells him, "Yeah, I just need 3 copies, please." So that's just one of the stories I tell about Mike. So, and all I have to say, how happy I am that we have Provost Winsick and President Miller here. For those that pay attention to the University of Akron or live in this area, you know that soon we're going to have just a fabulous case study written on leadership and its impact on a university. We've had various types of leadership recently, but I couldn't be more excited about the team of leaders we have in place now and the changes they're making in the positive direction. So very excited about that. Okay, so Dr. Greer at Michigan says, everything in a company is determined by the quality of team dynamics, and the ability to effectively lead teams is at the heart of managerial success. Most of you have that experience in whatever type of organization you're in right now, for-profit, not-for-profit, governmental, it doesn't matter. Teams are at the heart of success. So when does a group of individuals become a team? Well, it's when leadership becomes a shared activity. And in fact, in the most interesting research, and this is under the category of research we call shared leadership, it turns out that leadership actually moves around. Even though you're always going to have a hierarchical structure, the people who step up to offer their leadership about here's an idea, here's what we should do, here's where we should go, it moves around. And so in that dynamic situation, leaders and followers exchange those kind of roles. Even though it's not formal, that's how they act. So that's one of the things that's, I think, most exciting in the current research. Accountability shifts from strictly individual to both individual and collective. The group develops its own sense of purpose and a vision. And positive affect develops between members. And by affect, I mean the psychological affect, the good feelings, the camaraderie, the esprit de corps develops. That's something that's unique to effective teams. And then last, synergy is produced. So here are just a couple of examples, I think, of teams. The one that I have to point to that everybody in Northeast Ohio is very familiar with was the championship win by the Cavs in 2016. It was a big deal for us. Of course, it was our favorite son, LeBron, that kind of led our Cavaliers to the championship. But if you reflect back, we were not given a chance to win that because the Warriors, our competition, had overall superior talent on the team, and especially when we were down. So I think it's a classic example of team members working together to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. So we have special forces teams that achieve remarkable success and accomplish amazing missions, most of which none of us ever learn about. And we may hear some of those stories from Admiral Moore in a little while. Apologies. So how about corporate teams? Look at that ragtag band of misfits. A remarkable collection that turned into a team that produced amazing results and generated significant changes to the world and to economies. If you look at that group, I really don't know that I'd invest any money in them in 1978, but it was a team effort. Even though there are often specific individuals that get most of the credit, it was team effort that made things work. And then example, here locally, the Akron Zips football team, never mind about that one. But we know soon we're going to also have that championship level caliber come out of our football team. So I want to show a couple of very short video clips. This first one was actually a kind of a public service announcement in India. For those who are familiar with the country, India is extremely diverse. Many, many different languages, something like 22 almost independent countries with different foods and cultures and languages and things that need to work together to overcome obstacles. And so here's a video they produced. It's in Hindi, but I think you'll get the message if we watch it.
सर आपके लिए उस पार कार का इंतजाम किया है सर आइए सर चल चल
I hate this country.
चलो तो हिंदुस्तान चले तुम चलो तो हिंदुस्तान चले तुम चलो तो हिंदुस्तान चले तुम चलो तो हिंदुस्तान चले लगा हाथ के सूरज सुबह निकाला करे हथेलियों में भरे धूप और उछाल करे ओ लगा हाथ के सूरज सुबह निकाला करे हथेलियों में भरे धूप और उछाल करे उफक पे पाँव रखो और चलो अकड़ के चलो उफक पे पाँव रखो और चलो पकड़ के चलो फलक पकड़ के उठो और हवा पकड़ के चलो फलक पकड़ के उठो और हवा पकड़ के चलो तुम चलो तो हिंदुस्तान चले तुम चलो तो हिंदुस्तान चले हिंदुस्तान चले
So hopefully you got the gist there. The thought that came to my mind when the first time I saw this was, and a child should lead them. A humble child demonstrating effort and not giving up influenced others to join in. Together as a team, they accomplished something that was seemingly impossible. And that's true for almost every major accomplishment. It's some team that came together to do something remarkable. Here's a quick video that somebody took during a flood in Houston. And the situation is that there's an old man trapped in his SUV and the flood waters are rising. And you have some bystanders seeing this.
Keep chain going. Keep up.
So anyway, I think you get the idea there. They were able to rescue this old man from the vehicle before he got totally swept away. And it's one of those things that kind of gives you hope for humanity. Somehow, spur of the moment, somebody got the idea, almost like that little boy, maybe I can do something. And if a couple of us work together and a couple more people join in, they actually created this human chain to get out to that person and rescue him. So it really became a team effort, a common goal, a common vision, working together. This last one is from a CCTV camera in a Perth subway station. You're going to see there's no sound to this one. You're going to see an old man who's getting onto this subway, this train at the platform, didn't mind the gap, if you're familiar with London, and he slips and he falls. So there he fell, and now he's got his leg stuck down between the platform and the train. And I really wish we had sound, because I'm so fascinated at the dynamic that might be occurring here. So now you got people frustrated and wondering, oh, another delay, wondering what's going to happen next. And then people realizing, you know, maybe it's us that have to solve this problem. So people get together. Again, maybe it was one individual that started, others jump in, they're pushing on this train, and then realizing, you know what, it's a big, heavy train. It's not just something you can easily push. So it's not working. They're trying to figure out as a team effort now. You see more people join in, and then somebody, I think, is saying something like, okay, 1, 2, 3, kind of let's get a momentum together. And here at this point, they're able to get that old man up, that's him in the center, was able to get out, and everybody's able to move along. Again, remarkable team effort from a situation that was spontaneous. So synergy is a key element of every successful team effort. So what do we mean by synergy? That's when the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? The classic example is when 2 + 2 = 5. Something more is being generated than just the individual efforts. And in general, I have to say, if synergy is not being produced by your teams, why use teams? Sometimes I think in organizations, teams are put together without much thought. And if synergy is not being produced, it may not be the best use of individual efforts. So then I thought I would talk about, we've got a lot of experts going to talk about their experiences with how teams work. I thought I might portray how they don't work. So I'm going to tell you, if you want to prevent excellent teamwork based on the research we know, here are some things you want to do. So I've got 3 main elements. First is the idea of balance. You want to eliminate any kind of balance between people working individually versus as a team. You want to make sure instill plenty of biases that will derail the efforts. And you want to make sure that there's just blind following, that people aren't thinking or challenging. Okay, this is the best way to prevent good teamwork. So I'll go through each of these. First one is to be sure to ignore balance. So we know that almost every large-scale project, some real collaborative efforts are required, and those relate to teamwork. Usually it's cross-disciplinary, and that is the key to success. But the highest levels of creativity and problem-solving actually require deep individual contemplation. This only comes from solitude. So we have a lot of research on innovation and creativity. And by the way, of over 40 years of research now on brainstorming, brainstorming does not work. Now, when I say brainstorming, I mean the classic sense that Osborne developed it, right? There's a specific process for brainstorming. Most of us, when we talk about brainstorming, we actually mean let's get together and talk about it. And that is, of course, very important to do that. But I'm talking about the classic definition that Osborne uses for brainstorming. So it's important that people be able to spend time alone working on problems. And too often in organizations, when people are running from meeting to meeting to meeting to group interaction to group interaction to group interaction, there's not enough time thinking about problems and what to do about them. Here's a quote that I like from Todd Matchover. He's director of MIT Media Lab. He says, "There are times, especially early in the creative process, when I need to slow down and think about a challenging question all by myself." I think that's the classic example. You need to really just think about the problem. And he's the fellow who invented a game called Guitar Hero. I don't know if any of you have heard of that one. My kids played that a lot, so that's how I know about it. And some of you are young enough, perhaps that was a part of your lives. But those are sort of innovations that come from people spending time alone and then getting together with teams and talking about them. Number two, you want to make sure to instill plenty of biases in your teams. There are a lot of individual biases and there are a lot of group biases, and I teach about a lot of them. There are 4 specific group biases that I want to talk about here to make sure to derail your team efforts. So I'll go through those 4 individually. The first is social loafing or free riding. And I have to tell you that one of the main reasons when we see teams being less productive than individuals combining their individual efforts is because of this bias. It's the social loafing and free riding effect. It is the opposite of synergy. It turns out nobody wants to be the sucker holding the bag, doing all the work. And in many groups, everybody's afraid of that. So they want to make sure they're not the one having to be responsible for doing all the work. Some of my students I know have experienced this in teams, especially, the slackers are excited when they get on the team with the really highly conscientious, bright person they know is going to make sure to get an A no matter what. I'm glad I'm on that team, I don't have to do too much. And we see that in organizations in slightly different variations. So there are causes to this to make sure that you get this bias working for you. It's the inability to recognize individual efforts. It's when there's a lack of accountability. It's enhanced when people feel like their individual contributions don't really matter. And social loafing and free riding increase with group size. The more people on the team, it's easier to kind of hide in the team and end up sharing the credit for anything that works out well at the end. The research on these phenomena started many decades ago, and I just have to tell you, the very first studies were interesting. It was a set of experiments where the researchers brought on people to do a supposed tug of war, pulling a rope. And they put individuals kind of between curtains, and there's a big rope they could grab hold of. And the first set of studies, they said, okay, you're an individual, there's one other individual over here. When we ring the bell, we want you to pull on the rope as hard as you can. We're going to see how much force you can exert. So they did that with a number of people. They'd measured the force. And then they would bring in, again, test subjects and say, okay, now you're part of a team. You can't see your team members behind these different curtains. When we ring the bell, we want your team, everybody to pull as hard as can. Same basic instructions, except that one group thought they were part of a team and the other felt like they were individual. And it turns out when you actually measure the rope force exerted by pulling, the individuals almost always pulled harder than the people that thought they were on teams. And maybe it's because they didn't want to hurt their hands and knew others were going to help out, or maybe it's because they felt like, well, it's a team effort. And it could be also related to the other cohesiveness we see among great teams. When you don't know your team members, when you haven't developed trust, when you haven't developed an identity with them, that also is probably going to have an effect. So it is a problem we see across many organizations when you don't have that level of accountability, individual association, and when you don't feel strong value to it. Next bias is conformity. Nobody likes to feel ostracized or rejected. One of the most powerful forces we know in all of psychology is referred to as the similarity effect. Being similar to others. We're attracted to people similar to us. We like people that are similar to us. We associate with them. We want to be part of that in-group. So people choose, consciously or unconsciously, to conform to larger groups. We can see that by the way people dress. You want to make sure to dress somewhat, people want to stand out with your individuality, but you don't want to be too different. You're up with the fashions, the trends. Most of the men in here feel like, yeah, I kind of need to wear a jacket, even though ties are passé now, right? We have these kind of trends and fashions, and we want to feel like we belong, even though we may not want to look like every other individual. We're conforming to the group. So whether the conformance is positive or negative depends totally on the norms and the culture of that group. Excuse me. Here's a classic set of experiments done by a Professor Ash, and he did not know how to spell his name correctly, obviously. This goes back many decades. And so in this experiment, there are groups of people brought in, and the panel on the left was a line as the target. They show them this line, say, okay, now on the panel on the right, please identify which line you think is closest to the line length in the first box. So if I ask all of you which line, A, B, or C, is closest in length to the lines in the box, to the line in the box left, which would you say? Okay, so everybody says C. Here's the issue. In this experiment, they would bring in a group of people, and they would be asked orally, one at a time, which line do you say it is? Which line do you say it is? Which line do you say it is? And the kicker is, it's only the very last person that's the real test subject. Everybody else is kind of in on the gag. They're what we call the Confederates. They're part of the experiment. So every other person says A. So now you're the last person in the back room. You're going around. It's A. Oh, yeah, clearly A. Obviously A. When it comes to you, what do you say? Well, I know people in this room would speak up and say what they really thought. But in the experiment, you may be able to guess where people went. 74 participants conformed on at least one trial. Why? It clearly wrong answer, and yet they felt pressure to conform. And now we're going to speculate, maybe the person is thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, what did I miss here? Did I misunderstand the instructions? Or are they seeing it from a different angle from me? Or maybe clearly they're supposed to be responding in a different way. You're rationalizing in your mind, but the last thing most people want is to really look totally different from everybody else. They want to conform. There's tremendous pressure to conform in all types of teams and groups. Some other examples. National Transportation Safety Board, in a study, they found that 25% of all aircraft accidents could have been prevented if the pilot would have been challenged when making a clearly obvious error. I know, actually, it's a field I used to do a lot of research in cockpit crew management and aviation safety. In a recent survey of thousands of employees across lots of industries in the United States, nearly half agreed with the statement, I regularly feel pressure to conform in this organization. So why are they conforming to something they think is not right or not best? It's a bias we have to make sure to instill to make sure our teams don't work well. Next is the obedience to authority. Again, most humans exhibit an incredible amount of compliance with commands given by an authority figure. And most of you have heard about some of these studies, especially if you ever had a psychology class, but our example goes first to Stanley Milgram and the obedience studies. So you have to put yourself in the context. This is 1950s, actually late 40s when it started. Americans were trying to understand the acts of genocide that the Nazis committed in World War II. And of course, we all said, well, we would have never done a thing like that, right? There's no way we would have let that happen. And Milgram was interested in learning more about that. And remember that in the Nuremberg trials, that was the defense. Well, these individuals were just following orders. It wasn't their fault. They were just following orders. So it's really just Hitler. So here's a photo of Stanley Milgram with his shock box. And by the way, for those who don't know, we have a Smithsonian-affiliated Museum of Psychology located about 2 blocks from here, open to the public. You can actually go in and see this box, along with every other cool thing that's been done in psychology. So it's a fascinating museum a lot of locals don't even know about. So in this experiment, again, ostensibly 2 volunteers were brought into a room. there was a pretend choice, like a coin flip, to decide who was going to be the teacher and who was going to be the learner. The learner, which was really, again, a Confederate, went into another room where there was just a microphone and speaker, was hooked up to what looked like a really extravagant, shocking mechanism. The teacher was on the other side and controlled this box. Now, you had an experimenter there in a white coat, and supposedly it's learning experiments. And every time the learner got it wrong, you had to set another level of shock, increasing the voltage each time, right, to help this person learn. And the person that was in authority only had on a white coat, never showed any credentials, never talked about, exactly what was happening or why. It was really quite superficial. And it turns out that every one of the participants administered shocks that went up to at least 300 volts, each individual. 2/3 continued to the very highest level of voltage, marked 450 volts, and it had the label on there, danger, severe shock. Now, the actor in the other room was playing this role up. So they would get, and when students started getting high, they would start screaming in pain. Whoa, this is terrible, let me go, let me out, ouch, ouch. At some point, the actor would just become silent. So in other words, the person administering shocks doesn't know if they passed out, if they're dead, they don't have any idea. And yet, 2/3 kept increasing the voltage, delivering another shock. Some of them expressed some concern, and they had a real strong script. And so the guy in the white coat was allowed to say things like, well, you must continue. Well, it's important that you proceed. And after about 4 times that the person expressed concern, said, okay, we'll stop the experiment. Then we're going to force him. But nobody was actually making this person do anything. So it's rather alarming to know what people will do with a supposed authority figure. So this is not just one experiment. Variations more than 18 times were done in multiple countries. It turns out it's a human thing. It wasn't just the Nazis and not just one group of people. It's something we have to be careful for. Now, what does this mean for our teams? Do you want people to challenge? Do you want them to question? You have to be careful how you're creating a climate and a culture where those things are acceptable. So here's some examples historically. There's lots of them. Tragedies from obedience to authority. Again, of course, the German Holocaust, number one. Those of you remember My Lai in Vietnam. Other disgraces by the government, the Watergate break-ins, Iran-Contra, corporate scandals, too many to even list here, that we see all the time, where they were told to do it by somebody. The last category I want to talk about to make sure that we derail our team's effectiveness is groupthink. Groupthink is not a good thing. It's not people getting together and thinking together, come up with something greater. This is a biased decision-making that comes from group members striving for agreement. So that's the key. The most important issue for the group becomes agreement. They want to agree and want to get everybody else to agree. And this becomes what we call groupthink. So in these situations, the agreement among the group members becomes even more important than critically evaluating all the data or the options. And a note here, we really want to have cohesive teams where people identify and want to belong. But as cohesiveness goes up, so does susceptibility to groupthink. So think about Space Shuttle Challenger accident. Pardon me. Again, to set the stage, because this is a few years ago, there was, in hindsight, a really overly ambitious schedule of 24 shuttle flights by the year 1990. Up to this launch, there were 6 prior delays in launches. And so you had people like Dan Rather come on the evening news and he'd start off with, well, it's another day of red faces all around NASA as they had to scrub another launch. Pressure's building. For this particular one, if you remember, the entire world was watching and kids in classrooms were watching. President Reagan was going to call Krista McCullough, the first teacher going into outer space. It was a big deal, even though we had launches before. These are the 7 crew members that died because of this poor decision-making by a team. And a lot of them didn't die until they hit the water. So it was really quite a horrible situation. And some of you may not even know Judy Resnick she's a specialist on there, was from Akron. Her parents actually were Jewish immigrants, and she was the valedictorian for Firestone High School just down the road. And actually we have a school named for her by the Fairlawn Country Club, if you didn't know that. So what's interesting is, and I've spent a lot of time on this, I spent a couple years working with NASA on reducing team errors. If you really study what happened, it's quite fascinating. The night before the launch, there was a teleconference between the Kennedy Space Center, Marshall Flight Center, and Morton Thiokol, who made the rocket boosters. And the dialogue moved from prove to me that we should launch to prove to me that we shouldn't launch because of the pressures that they felt. And therefore, they all kind of caved. That next morning, 73 seconds after launch, an O-ring failed on a booster, and the whole thing went up. And for some of us, that's indelibly etched in our memories. It's one of those flashbulb memories that kind of sticks with you forever. The Rogers Commission report identified 2 key failures. One was the organizational culture, and second was the decision-making process. Turns out the Morton Thiokol engineers tried to warn their leaders and NASA officials in the night before the launch that the freezing temperature that was coming to Florida was severely going to impact the O-rings and their ability to seal. But a lot of pressure was put on them. Again, it's a classic groupthink where everybody just wanted total agreement. And multiple times throughout that evening, people would come back to, but if anybody thinks we shouldn't launch, we'll make sure and scrub it. And it's remarkable how they'd use kind of semi-excuse, even though they put a lot of pressure. Well, think about it again. Stop thinking like an engineer. Start thinking like a manager. Think about all the people that are watching. Change the entire frame. And in hindsight, obviously, it was a horrible decision that could have been stopped. So an extreme example of groupthink. We have lesser examples throughout organizations all the time. We don't critically evaluate information. So do you feel safe when speaking up? Think about your team. Think about your organization. So here's just a quick little scenario. Suppose that in a meeting with, if you could change that screen look just a little bit. Suppose you're in a meeting with a lot of important people and you finally get up the courage to tell your boss about your idea that you're developing for months. You know it's a brilliant idea, and you're excited to get recognition of this brilliant insight. Now suppose when you present your idea in this meeting, your boss in front of everyone snickers while shaking his head and says, I don't think so. Now, I know some of you, this is not a stretch, but imagine you had a scenario like that. What emotional response do you think you'd have? How would you feel? And more importantly, how likely would you be to speak up in the future with what you thought were great ideas? So the research stream that explores this is relatively new. Amy Edmondson has come up with this concept of psychological safety, and it fits a lot of the issues. So a lot of fascinating research is being done right now on psychological safety. When teams have psychological safety, members feel safe to suggest ideas, admit mistakes, and take risks without worrying about being punished or embarrassed. In fact, in Google, they had this big project Aristotle to figure out what was working best in teams. They found that psychological safety was the most important factor that set apart their most successful teams. Here are some of the things you can look at to determine when you have it or when you don't. When you have it, you see mistakes as opportunities to learn. You have a willingness to take risks and to fail. You feel comfortable speaking your mind in meetings. You openly share your struggles. You trust in your teammates and supervisors, and you're willing to stick your neck out. There is a hierarchy of communication. And one way of referring to this is beware of the hippo effect. The hippo effect is the highest paid person's opinion. When the highest paid person offers their opinion, it's remarkable how many people will align with that. And that's actually something we refer to as the sunflower effect. Because of this strong bias that junior people have to agree with the senior people, the reason they call it the sunflower effect, if you think about sunflowers, they're always going to be facing the sun, right? And so that you're always kind of admiring whatever the superior does. This would imply you should let your junior people speak first before offering an opinion, before expressing your thoughts about some project or mission or goal. And I have to come back and link it to groupthink. When Janice first started discovering this idea of groupthink, started writing about it, it was after the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba. Again, before most of your times, actually was slightly before my time even. But if you recall, it was an operation where John F. Kennedy, his cabinet, decided that, okay, Batista had been thrown out, this fellow Castro came in, he's a communist, they're 90 miles from our shore. We're sure no Cubans want that. He took control, and we're sure that there will be an uprising if we just light the spark to that powder keg, right? So they're going to send in operatives, and they thought they'd kind of go down the street, and everybody would join in and throw over Castro. It didn't work that way at all, for lots of complicated reasons. Afterwards, John F. Kennedy and his cabinet, they said, you know, that was really stupid. How could we have been so dumb about this? How did we let so many things go wrong? At that point, cabinet members said, well, actually, I had some real reservations about that. Or there's some issues that I had concerns about. But John F. Kennedy was a very charismatic, likable new president. Everybody wanted to be supportive. Everybody wanted to be part of the team. Nobody wanted to be a naysayer. And so, because immediately JFK expressed his support for the program, nobody shared their additional concerns. So I think it's a great lesson on how this can go wrong. So Ernest Hemingway says, quote, "The most essential gift for a good writer is a built-in, shock-proof shit detector." Apologize for my language, just a quote. I think that's probably true for leaders as well. We often learn more from those that challenge our thinking than from those who just affirm it. Reed Hastings, founder and CEO of Netflix, says, "Your job is not to try and make me happy or make the decision you think I most approve of. It's to do what's right for the business. You are not allowed to let me drive this company off a cliff." I love that thinking. And they create a culture where they believe it's tantamount to being disloyal to a company if you fail to speak up, and if you fail to disagree, or if you fail to give feedback that would be helpful. We know that silence implies consent, and so they're trying hard to develop that kind of culture. I have to actually give an example that I think is remarkable from within Netflix. The two characters in this dialogue that I'm going to present next they're from Brian Wright, and it's about Ted Sarandos. So Ted Sarandos is the chief content officer at Netflix. Brian Wright is a senior VP, recruited brand new from Nickelodeon. And Wright is the fellow who developed this show called Stranger Things, for which I know there are fans out there. So this is described in the book Netflix, The No Rules Rules. And pardon me for reading all this, but I think it's relevant. And so Brian says, "In all my past jobs, it was about who's in and who's out of favor. If you gave the boss feedback or disagreed with her in a meeting in front of others, that would be political death. You'd find yourself in Siberia. So Monday morning, it's my first day of this brand new job, and I'm hyper alert trying to find out what are the politics of this place. I attend my first meeting with Ted Sarandos, my boss's boss, who is, from my perspective, a superstar, and about 15 people at various levels in the company. Ted was talking about the release of, could you change that video look just a little bit again? I apologize, from the screen that I see. So he's talking about Blacklist 2, and a guy 4 levels below him, hierarchically, stopped him in the middle of his point and said, "Ted, I think you missed something. You're misunderstanding the deal. That approach won't work." Ted stuck to his guns, but the guy didn't back down. "It won't work. You're mixing up 2 separate reports, Ted. You've got it wrong." He says, "I cannot believe that this low-level guy would confront Ted Sarandos in front of a group of people like that. From my past experience, this was equivalent to committing career suicide." At the end of the meeting, however, Ted put his hand on the guy's shoulder and said, "Great meeting. Thanks for your input. I practically had to hold my jaw shut." He says, "Later that day, I ran into Ted in the washroom, and he asked me how my first day was going. I told him, 'Wow, I couldn't believe how that guy was going after you in that meeting.' Ted looked mystified. He said, 'We hire you for your opinions. Every person in that room is responsible for telling me frankly what they think.' Now I'm asking you, does this align with your experiences? Do you have a culture within your team where you can truly challenge whoever's there talking to you?" So there are real levels of task conflict. The absence of conflict is not harmony, it's apathy. A culture should accept and even promote active disagreement about multiple perspectives up until a final decision has been made. Then everybody better be on board. And one of my favorite photos of the peace team member beating up the protesters. So, to summarize this, if you really want to prevent exceptional teamwork, be sure to prevent a balance. Make sure you don't let there be any individual thinking. Make sure everybody's engaged only in meetings all the time. Make sure to instill biases to prevent good team decisions. There should be lots of social loafing and free riding, plenty of conformity, strict obedience to authority, and groupthink. And third, require blind following and inability to speak up and challenge. We know that modern organizations are not like organizations of decades ago. There's no one person that's smart enough to make all the changes and see everything that's necessary for success. It's just not possible. Therefore, you need to have team efforts. I think that in military settings, it's even similar. You know, my experience with the military is different from how a lot of people see it, where strict obedience to authority. That's not what I see at all. Rather, there's something that is referred to as the commander's intent. You have to understand what's the actual objective, what's the mission, and then you do whatever you can in your team to make sure it happens. It's not just do exactly what was told on a piece of paper. So there's no coincidence that the most effective organizations in the world utilize teams. It is pervasive. We all engage in teams in multiple levels in every organization. At the same time, if they're not designed and led correctly, teams alone will not solve an organization's problems. I apologize for missing the apostrophe on that. I'm embarrassed. But the bottom line is, just sending the memo, "Now you're all teams," is not the solution. It's finding ways to make teams effective, unless you're deliberately trying to derail their effectiveness. So I'm gonna, as I'm talking, I'm thinking of the quote from Rudyard Kipling in the Jungle Book, where he says, "The strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. Without the pack, the lone wolf cannot survive. It's the team effort that's required." And I'm just going to end with this quote by Margaret Mead. She says, "Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." Thank you very much for your kind attention.